Traveling down our biblical Highway 66, we have now completed the Gospels and are moving into the New Testament era with the book of Acts. The Acts is titled the Acts of the Apostles, although some have called it the Acts of the Holy Spirit. As we see the apostles, through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, the power of the Holy Spirit, taking the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the known world this time, especially into what was known as Asia and Europe, as well as in the Jewish world as well. So we have this picture that we actually pick it up at the Ascension, really, of Christ, the events surrounding the Ascension, chapter 1, verse 9. And after he had said these things, Jesus was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. So we have this great event where Christ goes back to be at the right hand of the Father, as he had promised to do long before. But just before the Ascension, he gave them a commission. We often think of the Great Commission back in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. But this one is just as powerful and as clear with chapter 1, verse 8 of Acts. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Judea, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest parts of the earth. This basically is the theme verse of the whole book, and so it's our key verse, 1:8. This is what it's all about from this point on. And also we're going to make our key phrase in Acts the Holy Spirit. For we see the power of the Holy Spirit coming upon them, and that makes everything they do possible. Without the Holy Spirit, they have no power at all. Matter of fact, it's interesting. We've got a ragtag group of disciples totally defeated at the time of the cross, and thereafter hiding in an upper room that now go out and shake the whole world up in proclaiming the gospel. That's only possible because the Holy Spirit has come upon them, indwelt them, and given them power. And we find that the initial act of that in chapter 2, often we simply refer to it as the day of Pentecost. It was at the Feast of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came and indwelt and baptized the believers and the disciples, and they began the process at that point of starting the church and training the church. The early church came together and had 5 tasks that they majored on. Chapter 5 in verse 41 and 42. In 41, they went about telling people about Christ, evangelism. And so as they went out throughout the world to talk about Christ, they brought people to Christ, and thousands in those early days came to him. When they gathered together, they had 4 more tasks that they performed. Verse 42, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Very simple, very straightforward, a wonderful reminder of what we should be about today as the church. As a matter of fact, I believe we should get back to the more direct, straightforward example that we find here. 4 things that they were involved with when they came together: the apostles' teachings, which will be found in the epistles, and we will be looking at those in the days ahead. And then there is fellowship. The church is not just a place of theological learning or teaching. It's also a place of fellowship, of communion, where like-minded people wrapped around Jesus Christ come together to share their lives and to minister to one another. And then we have the breaking of the bread. That is probably, almost certainly, the Lord's Supper there, a reminder of what he's done for us. And then prayer. They were a people that prayed. And these were the 4 tasks that they performed when they came together. This is what they wrapped their lives around. And then when they left that fellowship, they told people about Jesus Christ. The rest of the book of Acts is following what these disciples and apostles are doing. The first chapters from chapters 3 through 12 is about the apostles like Peter and James and some of the other disciples having great ministries, taking the gospel to Samaria, to the Gentiles, and people being saved in that regard. Saul himself comes to Christ in chapter 9, but his life and his ministry is not picked up on until chapter 13, when we call him Paul there. Chapter 13 to the end of the book is all about the ministries of Paul. That's because Luke, who wrote this book, and also, of course, wrote the Gospel of Luke, and so he's the most prolific writer of the New Testament scriptures. Luke traveled with Paul, and he chronicled the life and the ministry of the Apostle Paul, and we're so glad he did. Paul took 3 major missionary journeys into what we now call Turkey, and into Europe, all the way to Rome eventually. not as a journey, but as a prisoner. He went to Rome as a prisoner, and there he spent at least a couple of years in rented quarters, and there he wrote what we call the prison epistles that we will enjoy looking at in short order. And so we find this book of Acts is just filled with narrative and story. It's not mainly about doctrine, although doctrine is there, but it's telling us the accounts of what was happening in this early church as it developed in these early days. So we're so glad to see this, but it only goes up to the early 60s. And so John would write later on into the 90s. So we're not getting the full first century church picture here, but we get a lot of it. And Acts is indispensable to our study. So it's a wonderful look, and have a wonderful day in the Lord as we prepare to jump into the epistles, which I'm really excited about doing.